And so first off, we at Peaslee really want to offer a huge thank you to all of our community sponsors who have supported us, not only in this conversation in Cincinnati around affordable housing and different policies for how best we can move forward equitably in our city, but also just supporters on this event for part 1 and part 2. So in addition to Peaslee, we have Action Tank, All in Cincinnati, Cincinnati Action for Housing Now, Cincinnati NAACP, Community Matters, Greater Cincinnati Homeless Housing Opportunities Made Equal, Legal Aid Society of Greater Cincinnati, LISC of Greater Cincinnati, Over the Rhine Community Housing, and Women's City Club of Greater Cincinnati. So we just again want to thank all of our community sponsors. We as Peaslee are really excited actually to be a part of this conversation that's happening around equity in housing and development. And really know that the only reason that this type of conversation or this is happening is because of the people and the people that make up these organizations. And so we just want to offer, again, a huge thank you to all of our community sponsors and our community partners in this work. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, this is part 2 of a 2-part series, really diving deeper into inclusionary housing and specifically what it is as a policy, but then other cities that have used it as a framework. And we're excited to have, as I mentioned, a national expert here with us tonight who has worked in depth with other cities in developing out their policies and what smart cities have really done to really determine how this policy works better. Part 1 of the series focused on some of the basics of what is an inclusionary housing policy. And so we're going to offer a small recap of that tonight before we dive kind of deep into the main part of the event. And we also not only did that, but we addressed some common myths that can be associated with these type of policies and what smart cities have done to make these policies effective in their areas and in their regions. And specifically how they can offer a framework for this type of policy being used here in Cincinnati. And so on a base level, you could click the next slide. Inclusionary housing policies tie awarding of public incentives to private projects in exchange for a percentage of units being created, basically ensuring that they're income restricted to lower income residents. So whenever public subsidies are used, and it can be tweaked depending on different markets in different parts of the city, but on a base level, an inclusionary housing policy ensures that when those subsidies are awarded to a private project, subsidies like a tax abatement or a zoning change or free or reduced public land, that the public benefit that's received in exchange for that is affordable units. And so an example of that is an inclusionary housing program might require developers to sell or rent 10 to 30% of new residential units created to lower income residents for the length of the subsidy. And so IH policies help cities support in developing affordable housing units with in-kind subsidies, such as zoning variances, as I mentioned, public land or tax abatements. In what cities may lack in cash, they're able to award for the creation of affordable housing units. And so these are some of the reasons that over 700 cities across the country have looked to this type of policy as a smart tool in their policy toolkit, is because these policies not only in addition to creating actual units in hand, so actual units that can be felt by the community, but it intentionally ties equity to growth. It offers an additional stream of affordable units that don't use limited funds, such as federal or state funds that may be dedicated to affordable housing. And it challenges the natural inclination of the private market's segregation of our neighborhoods. And so I'll turn it over to Jen Ahrens, my colleague Jen Ahrens, who will talk a little bit more about why specific cities or how to smartly set these type of policies for cities.
All right, thanks, Joelle, and thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, as Joelle said, we're just gonna do just a brief recap here. I do want to mention that the event on May 3rd, the first event, did cover a lot of ground. So if you couldn't make it, we really want to encourage you to watch the recording of that event. And you can find that on our website at peasleecenter.org/rubric. But I want to just do like, what were the main takeaways, right? So first, it's just really crucial that we're all clear on what the target of Cincinnati's housing policy should be. Specifically, that means like producing and preserving rental units priced no higher than 60% AMI and homeownership units priced no higher than 80% AMI. And that's just simply due to the reality of our public needs, right? we highlighted, like, how do we know where the need is, right? We highlighted in our last event that these needs are obviously illustrated when you look at the housing cost burden in our city, right? So the private market is effectively serving folks who are who have incomes above the levels I just mentioned. While many of those below these levels are forced to pay more than a third or even more than half of their income just to be housed. And that is a condition that's both unsustainable and inhumane, right? Right, also that housing advocates in our city agree that we need inclusionary housing and that it's a key solution in making our city more equitable. So we looked at detailed assessments and engagement processes like those done by All In Cincinnati and Housing Our Future. All that stuff, right, points to inclusionary housing as a need. And we also know that we have plenty of studies and reports that demonstrate Cincinnati's needs and that inclusionary housing is a time-tested tool in the toolkit that's available to cities that are working towards greater housing justice. And then lastly, as Joelle said, we did quite a bit of myth busting. So, right, despite many common fears and kind of talking points in opposition to inclusionary housing, right, like the evidence that's available shows that inclusionary housing programs can effectively produce units that are affordable to folks with low incomes, that they work in cities like Cincinnati, right? So they're not just for like the coastal elite cities, that they don't have any serious negative impacts on the economy, right? So well-designed policies, they're doable, they're fair for developers, and they're easy for the private market to accommodate. So, shoot, yeah, what do we need? How do we get there, right? So I want to acknowledge that, right, what folks know about inclusionary housing is that good policies have multiple facets to them, right? So we first have to understand that design is really important. We need quality analysis, we need clear goals, and we need a mindfulness for details as we do the work. We also need to inform ourselves and our legislators about the major lessons learned from other cities. And we need to be thoughtful about how we apply those lessons to Cincinnati, right? So no two cities are exactly the same, but there are major lessons, right, that are learned. There are major takeaways, and we can apply them carefully to our local context. And that we need to make sure in order to make sure we set our requirements appropriately, right, we need a study done on financial feasibility in Cincinnati of inclusionary housing policy. And that there are national experts, right, who can help with this, right? Our city government needs to, like many cities before us, enlist the help of folks who know this stuff inside and out, who do it best. And that brings me to our guest speaker tonight. So I just want to briefly introduce Rick. Rick Jacobus is the principal at Street Level Advisors, which is a strategy and innovation firm focused on equitable urban development. Rick has more than 20 years experience working with cities and nonprofits on policy that advances equity across class and race. He founded what is now Grounded Solutions Network, a national nonprofit supporting cities and towns across the country in strategies to create permanently affordable housing. Let's see, Grounded Solutions Network has served as a consultant to many cities, including Minneapolis and Pittsburgh, who we talked about in our last event, among many others, in the design of inclusionary housing policy. Rick's the guy that, so it seems, they call in to crunch the financial numbers to make sure that the cities can get the most out of their policies while still maintaining healthy markets for development. For those of you who have used the inclusionary housing calculator that Peaslee has very enthusiastically shared out to community councils and folks exploring development, that amazing resource comes out of Rick's work along with some others. Rick's been a researcher and advisor on economics and community development at various organizations, including Cometrics, Burlington Associates, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and LISC. He's the author of a 2015 report that's essentially been like the nation's go-to handbook for inclusionary housing. And he's also been a lecturer at UC Berkeley and a contributing author to Shelter Force magazine. We're super excited to have him with us tonight to help us understand the importance of inclusionary housing policy and the roadmap on how to get there. So I am going to stop sharing and just go quiet and lob it to Rick to pick it up.
Great, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you all. I am going to go through some slides and just talk a little bit about inclusionary housing and how these policies have worked in other places and try to address some of the questions that I got ahead of time. And then I'll stop and we'll have time for questions from everybody. And let me start and see if I can share my screen. And can you see the slide? Okay, great. So I will skip the introduction slide because that was a great introduction. Thank you. And I'm going to just jump right in with, I don't have to really do this part either because you already did that. What is inclusionary housing? But just to recap, so inclusionary housing, or sometimes it's called inclusionary zoning. So you see it initialized as IH or IZ. The original policies were really built into zoning code, but more and more lately policies are sort of standalone ordinances. But inclusionary housing is just any kind of law that a local government adopts that requires or provides incentives to create affordable housing when we create market rate housing. And so there's a range of different programs that get sort of lumped together under this rubric. And I think they are rightly lumped together, even though sometimes they look really different in terms of the mechanics. So I want to start really back at the beginning and talk about what's the goal. What problem are we trying to solve with these policies? Because they're challenging to implement, and this is part 2 of a multi-part discussion. It's not a simple fix for everything. So we have to be clear about why we're doing it. And I want to start with this one aspect of housing policy, which is segregation, you heard about, right? And we're talking about racial segregation, but also income segregation. We've not done a great job of getting the affordable housing that we've invested in, whether it's public housing or whether it's nonprofit owned, low-income housing tax credit, affordable housing. We haven't done a great job getting that housing spread evenly throughout neighborhoods. The lower income housing that's publicly subsidized has been largely concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods have tended to be neighborhoods that have other problems, where the schools aren't the best schools in the region, where the access to parks aren't great, those kinds of conditions. And so what we've seen is this growing set of research studies that show really significant differences in the outcomes that particularly kids experience growing up in different kinds of neighborhoods. And so this one, for example, showed that middle income kids who grow up in low income neighborhoods have worse outcomes than low income kids that grow up in middle income neighborhoods, right? So the neighborhood where you grow up leaves a mark on you economically independent of your parents' income, right? Neighborhoods matter. And then this more compelling study in 2015 showed that it's not just that like some people choose to live in some kinds of neighborhoods and maybe it's about what kind of family. It's families that moved from one kind of neighborhood to another, that moved into neighborhoods that had more economic integration. Their kids did differently in life, and the earlier they moved, the better the outcomes for the kids. So there was this argument for, well, people should just move out of lower income neighborhoods. And I think that's the wrong message to take from this, though. What they really showed is that where you live really makes a difference in your life outcomes. And we need all of our neighborhoods to offer real opportunity to people, right? But we can't do that if we're constantly segregating on income. And so when you look at, like, for example, the challenges that we face around gentrification, there's a sense in which neighborhoods sort of flip from lower or more moderate income to higher or really high income. And that shift creates this brief window of economic mix, but then it's not sustainable, right? People end up resegregating. And so a lot of the concern about gentrification is feeling like your neighborhood's going to be taken away from you and it's going to become somebody else's neighborhood. And that's the same problem, right? That we need to have a way for people to access neighborhoods that are high quality and not worry that as soon as a neighborhood starts to have investment coming into it, that people are going to be pushed out. The other thing that I think is really important from all this research is that one of the things you hear a lot about why this kind of economic integration might be so powerful is this notion that somehow people are rubbing shoulders with the different economic class. And the research is really unequivocal that that is not what's happening, right? People in America, for the most part, don't spend time socializing with their neighbors of any income level. It's not a major source of people's access to jobs or other opportunities. So what they found is that the differences that they're able to observe in the outcomes for kids are coming from the nature of the place where people are living rather than interactions with their neighbors in their building or on their street. And so it's being away from crime, being away from the poorest quality schools in terms of like school conditions. It's being away from environmental hazards. These things make a big difference. And then being closer to more positive resources like parks and open space are really making a difference in the outcomes. And it's not like somehow people are socializing different, or they're getting different expectations or norms. There doesn't seem to be any sense of that. So, but it's really important then that people have the ability to access a range of different neighborhoods, and that if we're going to overcome segregation, we have to have a way to offer access. And we haven't been very good at providing that mechanism. And so inclusionary housing has really been one of the few tools in the housing policy toolkit that gets us low and very low income housing in the neighborhoods that have average quality or above average quality schools, that have average access to health and parks and open space. Like it's really, it's been our outstanding tool for getting access to opportunity. So just to give an example, this is Minneapolis. In 2019, Minneapolis underwent this comprehensive planning project, which they called Minneapolis 2040. They changed all the zoning rules for the whole city, really. And they said, we're going to try to make this Minneapolis more of an urban location. We're going to invest in transit. We're going to reduce parking requirements. We're going to create walkable communities, and we're going to upzone large parts of the city so you could do taller buildings. And as a part of that, we're going to build in equity. And so they spent a while and they thought through, what does that mean? And part of what that meant to them was, when we build new housing, we're going to include some affordable units. And so Minneapolis, after several years of study, adopted a requirement that 8% of new housing units be affordable to households earning 60% of AMI or less. Now that's for rental. I'll show you in a minute, considered a range of different options, but that was the level that they ended up with for now. And they've now been operating this program for 3 years. They've created 226 affordable units mixed into brand new market rate housing developments in 16 buildings. And they've also collected $6.7 million in lieu fee payments. So payments from developers that chose not to include the affordable units in their buildings. So that's a lot in just a really short period of time. And it's not, however, you'll notice, enough to solve the housing problem in Minneapolis, right? It's just a contribution toward that, both in terms of new units and in terms of new money. So there are, at this point, over 900 of these programs across the country, and they're very different one to the next. And some of them are requiring 40% of the new housing be affordable, and some of them are requiring 5%. And many of them allow for these kinds of fees in lieu. Others don't allow that at all. Some apply only in certain neighborhoods. Some are voluntary. You only have to do the affordable units if you take some kind of public subsidy or if you take some sort of development incentives. Others are mandatory, where you have to do it no matter what. And some of the mandatory ones come with incentives and some don't. So there's a pretty wide range of behavior. One thing you'll notice when you look at this map is that the inclusionary housing programs are concentrated in the high-cost coastal markets, right? It's California and Massachusetts and places like that where you see most of these programs, but we're seeing the fastest growth in less expensive or historically less expensive places. But one thing to note is that even in Iowa or Montana, when you see an inclusionary housing program, it's almost always in an area that's experiencing real estate growth. It doesn't make sense to adopt an inclusionary housing program if you're not seeing housing built, right? Like, not every community is undergoing housing construction, and your inclusionary program won't get you any units if you're not building housing already. So it's really a tool for places that are either experiencing growth or about to experience growth. And it's a way of sort of hitching our affordable housing wagon to that growth engine. It's only a piece of the puzzle. In every place where inclusionary is implemented, it's just one of several strategies. And it's really not the first strategy that anybody adopts when they're trying to address affordable housing problems. It's an advanced tool. It takes more infrastructure and requires more care and thought. And it's not going to work if you don't get the details right. But in a few places, it's a very large source of the overall housing portfolio. So in Boston, it's how they're getting most of their affordable housing units at this point in time. And I think that might be true in San Francisco as well. But in most places, it's not even one of the top two sources. It's just another source of affordable housing in an array of policies. And like I said, it requires attention to detail. So there's lots of policies that a local government can adopt that promote equity that are simpler or less, have fewer moving parts. Inclusionary is difficult for two reasons, maybe more than two, but two that I want to talk about. One is economic feasibility. Because it piggybacks on the market, it only works if it doesn't get in the way of the market. And so we have to be extra careful to make sure that we adopt a program that's not going to cause trouble or prevent the very development that we're counting on to provide the affordable units. And the other is it requires a significant amount of staffing and administration. So I'll talk a little bit about how do you make sure that you're ready to actually implement it, because where we've had problems with these programs, it's been when they have been understaffed, where the cities haven't really realized what they were getting themselves into and haven't had the time to deal with some of the issues that inevitably come up. But first I want to talk about the economics. And this, I'll just give you a little brief on, and if you have questions, hopefully we can talk about it more. The place I like to start is really pretty far from inclusionary housing policy, but it's when we do things to make our neighborhoods or our cities nicer, to make them better, however you define better, we automatically are making them more expensive. And I think that's just a little bit like it's sort of an obvious thing, but it's not how we normally think about our communities. We think that we're doing what we can to make them better and we'd like to keep them affordable at the same time. But the truth is that the prices, the rents that people pay are in some sense a function of how people perceive our community. And so if we make it better, it's going to end up resulting in higher cost at some point. And we don't want to give up on that. Like, we don't want to say, oh, therefore, let's not make our communities better. That's not the solution. So we need a different tool for how to manage this. So when we make a place better, the prices go up, everybody ends up paying more, like rents go up, home prices go up. Like it's a more attractive, more desirable place. There's more people that want to move here, live here. It's more expensive. Where does all that money go, right? There's money coming in the form of higher rents. Where does that money go? And, there's not one answer to this question. It goes to a lot of different places, but the one that I think is worthy of our attention and where a lot of the money goes is the land. And so a lot of the attention in inclusionary housing policy, people will think about the developers make money, developers are making money. But if you think about your community, there's only so many sites that are going to get built on. There's only so much developer activity that happens, even in a place that's undergoing a lot of growth. But the land prices go up everywhere when the rents go up and when the home prices go up, right? And so we have this idea in economics, which we call residual land value. And it's basically that if I'm going to build an apartment building and it's going to cost me, $10 million to build, and I can get so much rent that, the building's going to be worth $12 million at the end of the day, I got $2 million left over, I can afford to pay for land. But if the rents go up and now the building's going to be worth more, right? So now it's worth $15 million. Now I have $5 million left over, I could pay for land. Now I'd like to keep that as the developer, but if you own the land, you're going to see that just as clearly as I do, and you're going to charge more for your land. You're not going to sell it to me for $2 million when I could pay up to $5 million. So the landowners ultimately capture a lot of the upside from the work that we all do to make our neighborhoods nicer, better places, right? Every time we organize Little League or, clean up the park, we're contributing to the value of the handful of people that own property. Now, some people own single family homes, but a lot of the land is in the hands of investors. So inclusionary housing is one of several tools that we call land value capture mechanisms. So the policies, when they work the way they're supposed to, and most of the time they work this way, but not always, but when they work the way they're supposed to, what they do is they capture back some of that land value increase so that land prices go up more slowly, right? That when rents go up really fast and we add an inclusionary policy, the land prices don't go up as fast as the rents because some of that value ends up going to pay for affordable housing. And what that means is that a developer who's building a building, should be able to make the same profit that they would make on the building either way, whether there's an inclusionary policy or not. Now, developers like to argue this point, and I think in the short term, when you adopt a new policy, it is really true that it's going to come out of the pocket of whoever's owning the land at that time, and sometimes that's the developer. But in the long run, the developers facing an inclusionary housing requirement will all bid less for the land. They're all going to pay a little bit less for that land because they know they have to provide the affordable housing units. And so that's that they can't afford to pay what they would have paid before there was an inclusionary requirement. Okay, that's the end of the economic theory. So what happens when we get that wrong? If we require too much affordable housing, theoretically, the land prices should just go down, right? Now, I was talking about going up more slowly, but theoretically, you could just require a lot of inclusionary housing and the land prices would go down. But what we've seen in a couple of different contexts is that when the inclusionary housing policy is too strong, it pushes downward pressure on land prices, and property owners resist selling land for less than they used to be able to think they could get for it. And so you end up with people pulling their land off the market. So they sell less land. And when they sell less land, there's less housing that gets built, which actually pushes up rents because now we've constrained supply. So we're trying to avoid a situation where we require too much so that we end up with less affordable housing. And the question that people debate endlessly is, which of these things actually happens in real communities? And there have been a number of studies, and the vast majority of the studies have found no impact at all from the inclusionary housing policies because the jurisdictions have been pretty careful about how much they require. And they've required smallish amounts of affordable housing in exchange for very profitable development. And so for the most part, the researchers have been unable to see any impact. One study that did find an impact was this study in 2008 that NYU did. And it's one of the better design studies because they looked at a lot of different geographies. But they compared the suburbs in Boston and in San Francisco that had an inclusionary housing policy to the neighboring jurisdictions that didn't have inclusionary housing. And they watched them over a long enough period of time that they could see what were the trends in rents in those communities and in housing production in those communities. And what they found was a very small effect where they could measure the Boston suburbs that had inclusionary produced slightly less housing than the model suggested they would have if they hadn't had inclusionary. Of course, they produced vastly more affordable housing, but less overall housing by just a small amount. But in the San Francisco Bay Area, they had programs that produced a lot more affordable housing without any noticeable impact on the overall market. And so they document in the study sort of what the differences were and have some suggestions about how you design a program to get no impact, right? The ideal is we're not going to reduce the amount of market rate housing that we produce, but we're going to produce as much affordable housing as possible within that. And I think there's a room to debate, like a small decrease in the total housing production maybe is worth it for more affordable housing, but we don't have to design it that way. We really can have our cake and eat it too in this case because of this thing with the land values, because we can put downward pressure on land prices, and really, most people there's no public policy benefit to having higher land prices. So it's free in that sense. The other thing, one of the differences that they found between the Bay Area programs and the Boston area programs was the use of incentives. And so and this is especially important in a place like Cincinnati. So there's a menu of different incentives that these programs have. And a lot of times the program will be designed as you have to provide affordable housing, but in order to help you do it, we're going to give you one or more of these incentives. In your case, the situation is more like we're offering these incentives. Now, maybe we want to require affordable housing in exchange. It's a very different political question, but the economic question is exactly the same. It's how much affordable housing can we require of a project that gets the market rents that we see in this market, plus the subsidies that are available through these government incentive programs. The most common kind of incentive is what we call density bonus. And so we let developers build more housing than the zoning would otherwise allow. That makes their projects more profitable. We capture some of that profit back in the form of affordable housing requirements, and everybody's happy. And this is really the key to what they've done in Minneapolis. They just offered a lot more density, and they, the overall trade-off was a very good one for developers. They built more housing and more affordable housing because of the policy. The other things you see are direct subsidies, tax abatements, tax increment financing kind of schemes will often be used to help offset the costs of the affordable units. This is something we could discuss more in terms of your context, but there's the majority of programs offer some kind of incentive in exchange for the affordable housing. And there's a big difference between programs where the incentives fully offset the cost of providing the affordable housing and the programs where the incentive just partially offsets it, right? It's like we brought down the cost, but there's still a cost. The other thing that's people spend a lot of time thinking about when they're designing these policies is the in lieu fee that I mentioned. And I just want to say, most people's immediate reaction is, this is a loophole. We're trying to get units into these new buildings, and if we let the developers pay a fee to sort of buy their way out of it, that then they're getting away with something. And I had that same reaction when I started doing this work. And then I started getting into the details, and I did a study for Seattle, and I've seen the same math in other places, but in Seattle, we really documented that Seattle approved high-rise developments, and they required inclusionary housing in those projects as a sort of a voluntary, if you want the extra height, you have to provide the units, but you could pay a fee. And policymakers in Seattle were very disappointed when they found that almost all the developers were paying the fee. But when we went in and looked at it, the cost of building a high-rise, luxury apartment in Seattle was so high that the fee money that they collected was enough to build 3 affordable units somewhere else. And so because they allowed the developers to pay this fee, they got 3 times more affordable housing than they would have gotten. And we mapped the units. And in Seattle, at the time, they had available land. So they were able to build affordable housing projects in the same neighborhoods where they were building these market rate projects. So they got integrated neighborhoods, which is really what the research says is important. There's really no benefit from being on the same hallway with wealthier people. It's being in the same neighborhood where we get the benefits. So this was a good trade-off for Seattle. And there are other communities that I've worked in where the trade-off wouldn't have been 3-to-1, it would have been 1-to-1. And then at 1-to-1, I'm not sure I would have the same reaction. But at 3-to-1, it feels pretty clear to me that this is worth considering the in lieu fee as an option. So it's something that you could study in Cincinnati, like how much would an in lieu fee be, and would it work out? And really, would you be able to get units in the same neighborhoods? Because it's not going to be an inclusionary or policy if you're taking fees from here and you're sort of continuing to concentrate poverty in a handful of places with those fees. So I'm going to turn to market analysis, because we can talk all day long about this, and it's really there's just an enormous amount of energy that gets spent fighting on almost purely ideological terms about, like, is inclusionary good or is it bad? Does it help or does it hurt? Is it going to stop development in its tracks, or is it going to help get more built. And really, like, the answer is always, it depends. And so that's too bad, because it's sort of more fun to fight about things that don't depend, but it does depend. And so we spend a lot of time on market research and trying to use data to answer these questions about what will happen if we impose an inclusionary housing policy. So this is an example of the kind of analysis that cities typically do. This is from Pittsburgh, and they mapped out all the parts of the city where, and split them up by how high are rents and how much vacancy is there in the rental market. And then so that's the shades of red. The brighter red, darker red is the more expensive parts of Pittsburgh. And the yellow dots are places where multifamily housing permits have come in. So where they were, this is a few years ago. I'm sorry, I don't have the date on there. But this is where building was happening, right? And so you can see the building is happening mostly, but not exclusively, but mostly in the high cost areas, because building's really expensive, and you need the rent to be above a certain level to justify the expense of building the building. So you get new buildings in places where the rents are high. And so what Pittsburgh, what Pittsburgh took away from this was there were large parts of the city where people wanted more building to happen, but where the rents weren't high enough to support building today. And the fear was, if we impose an inclusionary housing obligation in those parts of town, it'll keep people from building there. We'll only get building in the downtown. And so they adopted a policy that identified a handful of specific high cost but gentrifying neighborhoods and said, we'll have inclusionary there and only there. Whereas most of the inclusionary housing policies apply across a whole city. Pittsburgh picked particular neighborhoods, and they're in the middle of adding neighborhoods now. So that they're saying, well, this has worked in those neighborhoods. Let's put some more neighborhoods in where we feel like there's a threat of gentrification or displacement. So Minneapolis had a pretty similar situation, and I'm sorry to show you a table with a million numbers, but I think it kind of helps to see sort of what we do behind the scenes to analyze the feasibility. So these are different neighborhoods. We looked at different neighborhoods in Minneapolis, and we separated them into the downtown, strong market neighborhoods where rents were high, basically, emerging market where rents were in the middle, sort of coming up, and then soft market neighborhoods where the rents were really low. And we looked at how profitable would a housing development be in each of those neighborhoods. And we looked at 3 different building types. A wood frame rental, which is just like a shorter building that's all wood, a mid-rise rental where it's, sort of wood on top of a concrete parking podium or, shop commercial space. And then a high-rise, which would be like concrete or steel tall building. And the top table here shows you how profitable each of those would be. And the green cells are the ones that were profitable enough that we thought a developer would move forward. And the gray is maybe on the edge, and the orange cells are, we didn't think somebody would be building. This is not meeting the sort of typical profit requirements that we found in the market in Minneapolis at the time. And so what you see is in the soft markets, nothing's feasible, nothing's going to get built. In the emerging markets, there's some marginal, like the inexpensive wood frame and the high rise also both kind of maybe could happen, maybe not. And then in the downtown, things are profitable, right? So then what we did is we tested, well, what would happen if we required that 10% of the units in each building were affordable at 60% of AMI? And that tells you basically what the rent has to be for those units. And so we just go into our spreadsheet and we say, let's just reduce the rents on these, these 10 units out of 100 or whatever. Let's see what happens to the profit in the building. And you can see the profits all go down a little bit. And, but for the most part, buildings that were profitable without the requirement are still profitable after, and buildings that weren't profitable enough to get built weren't going to get built anyway. But what we found in Minneapolis was that the mid-rise rental downtown moved from being marginal to being not feasible with a 10% requirement. And the emerging market high-rise went from marginal to not feasible. And so those two alone made a difference to policymakers in Minneapolis. And they said, well, we don't want to risk that our affordable housing requirement is going to keep high rises in these emerging neighborhoods from getting built, or mid rises downtown from getting built that would have otherwise been built. And so they adopted an 8% inclusionary requirement instead of a 10% requirement, right? Because that got them to the number that they felt gave them enough safety. Now, I want to point out that it's still true that at 8%, somewhere there's a building that would have been feasible if the requirement was 0, that isn't feasible at 8. And at 10, it's no different. It's just a question of how many buildings, and nobody really knows. Like these studies are not, perfect rocket science. They're just the best we can do. So what we're trying to do is give policymakers like an informed sense, a best guess as to what would happen. And we test this both with data and with real people. We meet with the developers, we give them a chance to poke at these numbers and to say, yeah, no, you're misunderstanding how it works here. And we learn a lot every time. Like you cannot do this without the active participation of the real estate developers who, won't like this idea almost invariably, but would much rather have a policy that's going to be constructive and work than one that's not going to work. And so we're able to get their participation generally. So what we're talking about here is a feasibility study, right? We get data on multiple different project types. We identify a minimum profitability requirement, and then we just compare how profitable is the building with the affordability requirement and without. And then similarly, and we didn't have to do this in Minneapolis, but similarly, we would do another table like that was, well, if we do the affordability requirements and we offer TIF, how does it look, right? We did have to do that in Minneapolis. So that's the idea. And this kind of study takes months. It's ideally done with a steering committee or a set of stakeholders. It's not just done in a vacuum by an expert who comes in. You have to be good. You have to shop carefully for the right consultant to do this kind of work. But it's a fairly well-established methodology. And we haven't seen examples where the studies were way wrong. There have been studies where the timing was really poor, where they finished the study and then the market crashed. But for the most part, the methodology is reliable. It's not, however, perfect. It doesn't guarantee that we won't have issues later. The other thing I wanted to say, and this is like almost a piece of philosophy here, but when we looked across the country at all of the inclusionary housing programs, and we tried to collect data on who has produced the most housing and then compare that to the features of their inclusionary policy. And one of the things that you might think we would have found is that policies that required 20% affordable housing would have produced more affordable housing units than policies that required 5%. And that is not what we found. And we didn't find that 5% produces more than 20 either. We found basically no correlation whatsoever between the level of the requirement and the number of units that were generated, over time. And the reason for that is the number one thing that drives production of inclusionary housing is the overall level of building. In cities that are building a lot of housing, they get a lot of affordable housing, even if they have a 5% requirement. And in cities that are not building new housing, a 25, a 30% requirement doesn't get them any affordable housing. And so the reason I bring this up is if you're an advocate and you're interested in inclusionary housing as a way to get new affordable housing units, you then automatically have to become an advocate for we need a system that produces housing overall as well, that the two go together. It's not, inclusionary is not the tool if you only want to build affordable housing. You have to create a system that encourages the development of new housing, makes it possible, and also makes it equitable together. That's where you get the most bang for your buck in inclusionary housing. And that's not to say you just build, baby, build, right? You have to tie the two together. That's where we get the most production. The other thing that's sort of like that is predictability then is really important. And so inclusionary, one of the downsides of this policy is it's really controversial. It's really easy for developers to stand up and say, if you adopt this, very expensive requirement, it'll bankrupt us. We won't be able to build. No one will build in the city ever again. And that's pretty much what we hear every time from somebody. But when you look at the cities that have adopted it, that isn't what happens. People keep building. Sometimes there's a little slowdown or like a rush to get projects approved right before the inclusionary kicks in. But we don't see cities that have just brought development to a standstill because of their inclusionary housing policy. But if we want the landowners to be the ones that pay for it, it has to be predictable. Developers have to be able to go in to that negotiation with the landowner and say, look, you're going to face this requirement on this project. Yeah, it's not going to be built for a couple of years, but that's what the requirement's going to be. And they have to believe that it's stable. And so there's a temptation to want to like adjust the requirement over time as the market ebbs and flows, and to constantly tinker with it. And, some of that is okay. We think you should, revisit it every 5 years or so. But if you're changing it annually, you miss out on the benefit of capitalizing it into the land values. And what happens then is developers end up having to pay it. And then it really does cause economic problems. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is just this program administration. And I don't have a whole lot to say, though I'd be happy to answer questions about it. But I stress it because it's one of the big pain points that we've seen. In order for an inclusionary housing program to be successful, the local government has to have capacity to administer the inclusionary housing program. And we've seen a lot of cities adopt it as if it was free, because it's free in some sense. So it seems like it should be free and not anticipate the cost of administration. And so you need staff that can work with developers when they're coming in and help them think about their options. Should I pay the fee, or should I do the units on site, or what income levels, and those kinds of things. And then you need staff to be able to help developers make sure that the rents that they're proposing or charging on those affordable units are the appropriate rents. So suddenly we're sort of in their business in a way. We're telling them what the rent needs to be, or for sale units, we're telling them what the pricing needs to be. And it's just a bunch of back and forth about making sure that people understand the rules and that the rules are fair and appropriate. Similarly, with marketing, if we're going to have this sort of handful of deeply discounted housing units that are privately owned, we have to have a system for making sure that everybody has an equal chance of getting at those units, that they're not going to relatives of the developer, or that they're not just being secretly leased to whoever, but that there's a public, transparent system. And that can be time consuming to monitor and to manage. And the government needs staff to work on the marketing of every single building. Even if the developer is primarily responsible, the city has to be part of the process to some degree. Some cities take on eligibility screening. So like if somebody's going to live in the unit, they have to be income eligible. Somebody has to review their forms and make sure that they really are income eligible. Some require the developer to do that. But either way, there's work setting up the rules and having clear processes and having the answers to all kinds of questions about, like, well, what happens if you're making your money seasonally, or what about inheritance? All these what ifs. And then lastly, if you're doing home ownership units, there's a whole other set of issues related to making sure the buyers can access financing, but also the units can stay affordable over time. So you have to have a formula for the resale pricing of units and how to manage making sure that homes stay affordable, but you have to do that in a way that makes it possible for the buyers to be able to get a bank loan. So that requires some work. So all of these things have to happen. And then there's this sort of long-term, what we call long-term stewardship, where we have to monitor the units and make sure that they're still occupied by the right income group. We might have to do enforcement from time to time. Somebody might have to get sued at some point. And then if there's for sale units, we have to manage those resales over time. And I don't say all that to scare you off, because even small cities routinely pull this off. But in a small city, this can all be one person's job. In San Francisco, this is 25 people, right? So it's just to give you a sense that you need to think through what's the scale of staffing that you'll need to make this work. And if you're not going to get enough affordable units to justify that staffing, inclusionary is not the right strategy. And there's really not a big shortcut. The one thing that sounds a little bit like a shortcut, which is that you can outsource some of that post-purchase monitoring. And there's a number of successful models where either a private entity or a nonprofit, and increasingly a community land trust, will take on the monitoring, particularly for the home ownership units, but sometimes even for the rental units on behalf of a jurisdiction. And you can get some real economies of scale if you specialize in it. And it's sometimes cheaper to have somebody outside of government do it. And honestly, it seems to work really well, like to have a community organization that's in there monitoring. But then that has its own, you have to have rules for that. I'll just mention, this is the last thing I'll say. In Chicago, the city created a community land trust specifically for the purpose of managing and monitoring the for sale units that were created from their inclusionary housing ordinance, because they just thought it was going to be too much for the city to take on its own, and they wanted more accountability, and they wanted a way to sort of preserve the affordability long-term without having to have the city involved in everything. So, so that this is a question that, as you think about a program in Cincinnati, you have to decide, is there somebody that could do this? Is this capacity that we have to build inside the city hall? But one way or the other, you have to have an answer to who's going to do each of these tasks. And I'm going to stop there and see what kind of questions you have. Thanks a lot. Did that stop? Yeah, great.
Thanks so much, Rick. One question that just came in is one that says, have you found other equitable development policies that addressed integration better, or is inclusionary housing policy the best for that?
That's a great question. There's a website called localhousingsolutions.org that inventories dozens and dozens of different local housing policies, including several that address integration. The inclusionary housing is the headline in that story. When people talk about housing policies to address integration, inclusionary housing is the top thing you hear about. The other place where there's a lot of attention addressed integration is in the sort of public housing renewal, when we rebuild public housing. And there's been a lot of learning and effort in creating mixed income communities out of formerly, public housing properties. There are, the Section 8 program, or the vouchers program, offers the opportunity for tenants to live theoretically anywhere in the market. But what we've seen a lot is that the rent limits in those programs prevent tenants from accessing the sort of higher cost parts of many cities. And so we have this program that's sort of theoretically about integration, but hasn't in practice been delivering on integration very well, in my opinion. There's probably several others that I'm not forgetting. That I'm not remembering, excuse me. What's next?
Okay, this is a little bit similar, but you said that the benefits of inclusionary housing aren't really from different income levels living within the same hallway as much as in the same neighborhood. Can you talk about the best ways to integrate lower and higher income levels within the same building or within a neighborhood? What's the best way to think about this mix once inclusionary housing policy is required and undertaken?
Yeah. In the context I mentioned before of the mixed income communities that are being developed on public housing sites, there's a lot of work that's gone into kind of the social design. How do you kind of create an environment that's welcoming for integration and mixing? And I think the results have been fairly mixed, though they've clearly learned how to do that. So if you're trying to do that, it can be done. In a market rate, privately owned market rate building, one of the problems that we see in some of the super high cost markets is that there's this like alienation where the low income tenants feel like they're not supposed to be there, even though they are supposed to be there. It's, there's just like, well, everybody else makes more money. And there's a lot that cities can do to reduce that kind of, I don't want to say stigma, but, it's sort of in the direction of stigma, like to make it more comfortable. And so, in New York, they allow buildings to have amenities like pools and decks that are only for the market rate units. And that feels kind of gross. The but the big takeaway for me is that that stuff is really not that important. And it's people want to have stable housing, and they want to have stable housing costs, and that's really important. And like there's a lot of best practices, but sometimes people will use those examples like the New York pool thing as an excuse not to do inclusionary at all. And nobody's better off if if the alternative is I can live in a building, a luxury building, and I can't access the pool, I'd rather do that than not live there. Better still would be I can live there and I can go to the pool. But like the big ticket question is, what neighborhood are you living in? And so they had this controversy in New York about what they called the corridor, where for reasons of financing, they were building these buildings with like the affordable housing over here and the market rate housing over here. And people thought that was kind of like the pools, where it created this stigma, oh, these people have to go in the other door. And so what they did is they banned the corridor. And what that meant was developers had to build the affordable housing units in a different borough, like somewhere far away. So they were still segregating the lower income people from the market rate people. They were just segregating them even further, and everyone was happy with that. And that seemed like a terrible outcome to me. Like, because the goal is what school do your kids go to? How far is it to the nearest park? What kind of health services are nearby? What kind of access to fresh produce is there nearby? Those are the things that matter. And do you socialize with the people down the hall is not as important to me.
Thanks so much. Here's a good one. Where'd it go? Okay, are there policies or ways to curb the ownership of housing by private equity and corporations? Are there ways to ensure all units are rented out and not unoccupied, rather than just building more?
Okay, let me do the second one first, and then you probably have to remind me of the first one. But the vacancy, so there are several cities that have taken on the idea that there are vacant units. Like, we have a housing crisis. Why are there so many vacant units? And they've adopted what's called a vacancy tax. And so you can basically tax just the vacant units, and it A, raises some money, and B, creates an incentive for people not to leave their units vacant. I would say, though, where people have rigorously studied it, it turns out there's not a whole lot of, in most cities, there's not a whole lot of vacant units. There's the occasional unit where somebody's, like in San Francisco, they have Russian oligarchs that buy super expensive units and just leave them sitting empty. But it turns out not to be nearly as big a problem as most people thought, or the people who were concerned about it thought. Like, there's not that many Russian oligarchs. So as a percentage of the overall housing puzzle, adding a vacancy tax didn't free up a whole lot of housing. But if you've got Russian oligarchs, you might as well tax them. I don't imagine you have a lot of them in Cincinnati, but let's tax them. The other question was, can we stop private equity from owning everything? Is that basically what the question was?
Curb the ownership of housing by private equity and corporations.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is yes, there's a way to do that. And also, no one's doing that. The American cities have been fighting with their hands tied behind their backs for the most part. This is just editorializing. We don't generally have a comfort level with trying to curb the speculative investment market, but it's completely possible to do. And what it looks like is what they call social housing. And so in a lot of European cities, the entity that sort of resembles what we call the housing authority doesn't just build housing for low-income people, it builds housing for everybody, and competes with the private market. And governments are able to borrow on a very long time horizon at a very reduced interest rate, and private equity is very expensive, right? So a private equity firm is getting 25, 30% return on their investment regularly, and the government can borrow at 3% or 5%. And so, so if we were willing to do it, it would be theoretically possible to compete and offer market rate housing that included affordable units. And it's just not something that American government sees itself as being good at. And so even in, cities like San Francisco, where there's a lot of will, or Seattle, where there's a lot of will to do this, they have yet to take it on. Seattle has a ballot initiative right now to create a social housing entity that would build market rate housing with government money. I will see if it passes. I don't imagine that I've not been following it that closely, but my guess is it won't pass, because it feels like doing too much. But that's what you would have to do if you wanted to take it on. What we don't seem to have good models for just encouraging local investment instead of national investment. Like these hedge funds have been successfully purchasing more and more real estate, and more they're driving the real estate industry, and it's fewer and fewer of the local investors, the dentists and the doctors and that sort of thing, and it's more and more Wall Street managed hedge funds. And I got to say, there's pros and cons to that. It's not all bad news, but it's pretty bad news. I'm happy to say more about that if you have more questions.
I have another one now. What are some of the impacts of inclusionary zoning on the market share of housing and land that is publicly owned and managed versus privately owned and managed, either for or nonprofit private? So I guess the breakdown on the market between public and private.
Right. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. In most cities, if we're just talking about the land that's housing, or literally just housing units, most of the housing is private, and there's a few percentage points of housing that's either nonprofit or public owned, that's affordable, regulated affordable housing. In some cities, that's 10 or 15% of the total housing stock. I don't know what that translates into in terms of the land, because most of the land, even in a city like San Francisco, where I think they're above 15% affordable housing, most of the land is taken up with single family homes, and the affordable housing is, stacked on top of itself. So it's probably a lot less as a percentage of the land. I don't know that that's the most important metric. I mean, I think that it matters. What's the gap between the need for affordable housing and the supply of affordable housing that you have? The market, for all of its challenges, mostly meets the needs of people at a certain income level. And then, like you saw in that slide at the beginning, there's this segment of the population that it just isn't serving at all. And most cities are focused in their housing policy on trying to fill that gap. And so there's not probably one magical percentage. That gap, I think all I could think about when I saw your chart for Cincinnati at the beginning here was how much better it looks in Cincinnati than it does in Oakland, where I live. That gap is just so much bigger here. So we need a much bigger share of the market to be affordable housing than you do, at least right now.
Okay. If a neighborhood has experienced gentrification widely, have you seen it be able to get back to a more just distribution of housing for all?
No. What I have seen, and rarely, but what I have seen is where neighborhoods have successfully avoided gentrification that people felt was imminent. And so there are lots of examples. Like gentrification is kind of a weird thing because nobody has a really specific definition, or there's no one accepted definition, and so it's a little bit hard to track data on gentrification. But you can very easily find places where people feel like gentrification is a real threat. And of those places, some of them, you come back 10 years later and they just gentrified, and it's really obvious that's what happened. And others have managed to hold off gentrification. And What we don't really know is were they people just wrong that it was not going to happen? But I see inclusionary housing as part of that story. And sometimes in these talks, I tell the story of the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which, you know, I is not probably the best example for Cincinnati, but it's a good story because in the 70s, neighborhood activists saw the threat of displacement coming. And, you know, before everybody in San Francisco talked about gentrification all the time, the neighborhood leaders in the Tenderloin said, we need to have a strategy to prevent the displacement of this very, very low income community. And so they started buying properties, and they bought them in a ring around the neighborhood. And they purchased with city money. They purchased through a set of different nonprofits, like a related set of nonprofits. They purchased dozens and dozens of buildings over the course of 30 years. And now, this is a neighborhood in the center of San Francisco, and they really don't have a lot of gentrification pressure, and all the neighborhoods around them have been completely decimated by gentrification. And it's because they purchased a lot of the land and they took it off the market and they held it. And, you know, some of it they leased, but they leased with very long-term leases, but they just got the land off the market, which I think is what you're getting at with these questions. But it's, you know, it's like, it was a very conscious and very protracted strategy over decades. But I don't see examples where, and inclusionary housing is relevant in that sense, in that where they have new housing coming in, they get, in San Francisco, you have to do, let's say 15%, that depends on a lot of things, of your units have to be affordable. And so in a neighborhood like the Tenderloin, they've got an installed base of so many affordable housing units in buildings that are 100% affordable. And then they're getting new buildings, but those new buildings have to be 15% affordable. So the overall percentage mix is pretty modest. Like, there's always low-income people going to be in that neighborhood. And so to me, it changes the character and the identity of the neighborhood, that when you market that luxury tower in the Tenderloin, you can't market it as like, this is the new neighborhood that's everybody's going to get displaced and this is going to be the hip new neighborhood. You have to market it as, this is a mixed income neighborhood with, you know, that's permanently going to be that way. And we're going to have a place in that neighborhood. It's not going to be, we're flipping. It's the flipping narrative that you're trying to fight.
Thank you. Here's another. Are there cities that successfully use their local HUD housing authority to filter eligible households into affordable inclusionary housing units?
Yeah, not as many as I think should. So one of the first inclusionary housing programs is Montgomery County, Maryland, and they have a policy that allows their housing authority to take units. The developers have to build the units for the inclusionary housing program, and the housing authority can basically buy them. And they operate a scattered portfolio of units, and they place extremely low-income folks into luxury housing all over Montgomery County. And it's just, everyone just accepts it as the way it works. That's just how it works there. And I don't know all the pros and cons of that, but it seems like a pretty good strategy to me.
Okay. This is a question about making home ownership more accessible. Do you know about the success of rent-to-own programs like Divvy? And how else can developers open access at lower income levels for home ownership?
I haven't heard of Divvy. I have been studying rent-to-own quite a bit. Can someone tell me where Divvy is or whose program it is?
Let me see if I can.
Well, let me answer generally, and if you can come up with that, that'd be great. But so inclusionary housing programs generally apply both to rental and ownership. If a developer's building condos or townhouses or a subdivision of single family homes, they'll have to provide some number of units that are sold to low income families at below market prices. And in some cases, that's half of what they would sell for otherwise. And I think it can be a great way to produce for sale units. And like in California, it's one of the few ways that we get for sale units that are accessible to low income families. Most of the federal subsidy for affordable housing is now tied to rental only. You can use home and CDBG money, but you can't use like the low income housing tax credit very effectively for sale. So there's just not many programs that do ownership for low income families. And so inclusionary has been a great way to get some supply for those families. The lease to own is challenging. It might make sense in Cincinnati. Basically, I mean, there's a big lease to own program in Cleveland. Maybe that's the same one. The Cleveland, they use the low income housing tax credit to do lease to own. And the problem is you have to wait 15 years. So like the investors have to own the building, the house for 15 years. And then at the end of that, the low income family can buy it. And most people don't wait around 15 years. So it's somebody different that's buying it. So there's just this, any lease to own program, there's this like question of, well, why don't we just help people own right now? You know, like if they're going to own eventually, let's just get them all the way over the threshold and not have this unknown down the road and have to finance it two different ways and let's make it so people can buy now. And a lot of the lease to own programs were popular in the 80s and the 90s when it was very difficult to get lower income buyers qualified for a mortgage. And it's still not trivial, like it's still difficult, but with enough down payment assistance and a little bit of credit repair, we're usually able to get people directly into home ownership these days. And there's programs that make it easier to qualify for a mortgage. And so, my opinion is like, don't do lease to own until you've given up on straight to own, because, you're helping families right away and they should be building equity right away. And if that's the point, let's just do it.
I got unmuted because they wanted me to explain, I guess, what Divvy is.
Oh yeah, great. Thanks.
So essentially, it's a 3-year lease that you sign with Divvy, and then Divvy allows you to basically purchase the home with an all-cash offer. So especially in this tight market, you can compete for a house. But then you basically make payments on top of your rent payment during the 3 years, and then if you walk away after 3 years, you've earned you basically walk away with part of what you've saved through your forced savings, and then it's contractually you can purchase the house at the price from 3 years ago. I'm still kind of learning about it. I'm not sure if there's some poison pill in there, but it's just something I heard about recently.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'll look into that. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, mostly what I work with is like government funded programs. So that sounds like it's a private initiative. And what we do when we're trying to have that same kind of outcome with the government program. So for example, I mentioned Minneapolis collected all this money from in lieu fees. One of the things that they do with that money is they invest it in purchase assistance, and we used to call it down payment assistance, but really it's a lot more than just a down payment at this point, to low income families. And so instead of leasing for 3 years and trying to see if you can sort of squeeze it in, what they do is they put public money in alongside your private money so that you can buy. Now you're not getting all cash purchase, but you qualify for what you can qualify for a mortgage, and they put public money in to bring the cost down to that level. And then when you leave, you pay them back their money plus a share of the increase in the price. And you get the share of increase in the price on a house that would have been what you could have qualified for if there was one available, but you get to buy a house that was a lot more expensive than what you would have been able to buy on your own. And that's a good deal for the public because they get to recycle that money. And it's a good deal for the homeowner because they get to buy a house right away. And you don't have to put money into a program and then hope that the residents can manage to pull the trigger to purchase later. You can just help them right away.
Rick, I got another question. Can you speak to your experience coming in as a consultant to cities that are interested in inclusionary housing? Who are the players and stakeholders needed to do this well, and how can local communities best prepare?
Great question. That's, I should say Cincinnati's a little far for me, so this is not going to be a self-interested answer as it might otherwise be, because I'm in California. But the process that I like to pursue is to have like a study group or a working group of stakeholders that includes either some of the elected officials or, you know, sort of their proxies, as well as some community stakeholders, you know, tenant advocates, home buyer advocates, somebody who does home buyer counseling, that kind of thing, as well as a couple of the real estate developers that are building for sale housing or for rent housing, market rate housing in your community, and try to get a diverse cross-section of people and then walk through a series of topics about, you know, how would a policy work? What income level would you target? Would you allow fees or not? Would it apply everywhere or just in a few places? And the Grounded Solutions, inclusionaryhousing.org has kind of like an agenda for that discussion. And you just walk through those topics and people disagree and you end up compromising and you come up with a proposal, and then you take and simultaneously do a feasibility analysis. So while the stakeholders are talking through the policy design, somebody is crunching the numbers and looking at what are your rents and how profitable is development and what would happen if we required more or less affordable housing. And you come back together with those two things, and somebody, presumably staff at the city or, you know, whoever's running the process, packages it up into a proposal and takes it to city council for adoption. And, you know, in the best situations, it comes in with this diverse working group recommends to council this set of policies. And sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes it's the city staff vetted this with this working group and some people liked it and some people had concerns, and here's a summary of what their concerns were, but here's our recommendation. And then the council ultimately has to make a decision on a policy, and invariably they end up with their own opinions and they change things. But it's a protracted process. You should expect it to take a year, even if you set a 6-month timeline. You know, it's going to take a while because people have to get used to it. It's a different role for government to play. And, you know, you can engage a consultant for pieces of it or for the whole thing. You can have somebody sort of lead the whole process, or you can just have someone come in and do the economics piece while someone local leads the decision-making piece. A lot of times cities will include, do an analysis of what other similar jurisdictions have done. And so you get like kind of a table of like, well, here's what they did in Nashville, and here's what they did in New Orleans, and here's what they did in Louisville, and you kind of compare them. And that's a typical piece of work. I don't think it's super helpful, but it's common. It gives some reassurance to the elected officials that like they're doing something that's been done before and they can see where they fit. So that will often go with the, you know, community process and the analysis. So there's sort of three pieces: facilitated working group to design a policy, an economic study, and a comparison study, or, you know, a summary of comparable programs. Those are the typical consulting engagement.
Yeah, Jen here. I'm gonna jump in because I know we are quickly approaching the end of the event. I know we've worked, Rick, on a number of different answers that are, or some aren't, actually specific to inclusionary housing policy, but like really rich discussion, and so grateful to all of you who submitted questions and have engaged meaningfully tonight. I'm gonna just quickly share my screen one more time, and Joelle, do you want to just kind of close us out with, again, a little shout out to our spot. First of all, maybe, I don't know, it's real awkward when you're online. You can't do like a round of applause. Everybody can just do a quasi round of applause for Rick and for him sharing his time and expertise with us. It really means a lot, and we're hopeful that you know, the conversation will live far beyond just, those who are on the call tonight, we plan to share the recording as widely as possible. This is a really timely and really informative discussion for us in Cincy. So yeah,
And
with that,
thanks for having me, and keep me posted. Let me know if there are questions that come up later as well.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm sure there will be. So yeah, I really appreciate the time and the energy and commitment. So yeah, thanks. Yeah, Joelle, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do just want to echo Jen on thanks for Rick and all of the work that you've done, even presenting tonight, especially just making resources available. And I want to echo what Jen said. So the recording for the first event is available on Peaslee's website at peasleecenter.org/rubric. And then at the conclusion of this event, this recording will be available there as well. As we close our series, we again just want to offer a huge thanks to all of our community sponsors and all of our community members that have been pouring their knowledge and their expertise and their viewpoints and their experiences into this work that we've been doing here in Cincinnati. We've been trying to figure this out for a long time. This isn't our first stab at trying to put policies in order and try to have impact in our neighborhood. So we just want to, again, thank all of our sponsors. One sponsor that's not listed on here, but has been a consistent funder of Peaslee's work on this specifically is the Season Good Government Foundation. And so we want to offer many thanks to them as well as they've continued to support us in our efforts here at Peaslee. And then on the next slide, we just have a couple of actions that you all can take to continue this conversation. So City Council, they are pretty soon about to go on break, but before they do for the summer months, they are still in the process of their respective committees as well as their council meetings of looking at different suites of policies to try to put kind of a policy platform or a list of policies specifically regarding equity and housing and affordable housing together here in Cincinnati. And so we at Peaslee, we've remained advocates along with our community partners in inclusionary housing being one of those tools and one of those policies that's going to help set the framework for Cincinnati to build more equitably here. And so one action that you can take just as any citizen or any concerned person in the city is to email your council members. This email that is listed on the screen is an email that will go to all 9 of our council members. And you can just voice your support for this type of inclusionary for this type of policy, and or even some of the specifics that Rick mentioned toward the end around a working group, wanting to see more action regarding an economic feasibility study. Any of those concerns or any of those insights, when presented in numbers, draw attention from our council members. So feel free to send an email to each one of our city council members, our mayor, our city manager. And then in about 2 weeks, there is going to be a citywide housing summit that is being put on by the city of Cincinnati along with other community partners. That is happening June 11th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. and it's going to be located in Price Hill. If you're interested in attending, please you can follow this link again that's on the screen, and you will be able to register and receive more information about that housing summit. But we're also just encouraging folks to, again, make their voices heard, rather through email or in-person opportunities around the importance of this policy and how it's necessary for us as a city to move forward. And then the last piece that we just want to highlight is that Peaslee has been doing work or trying to figure out the inner workings of a inclusionary housing policy on the ground level for about 4 years now using our equitable development rubric. So if you're interested in learning how to put things in place currently in your local community council or your neighborhood, please make sure that you go to peasleecenter.org/rubric, where you can get more resources and more information on right now tools that you're able to access to try to better leverage some community benefits in use of our public subsidies. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to Jen or myself at Peaslee. Peasleecenter.org is the best way to contact or to receive our contact information. But we again just want to thank you all so much for spending your afternoon with us. It's a nice, warm, sunny summer day. So for you all to be here and be present with us, it really means a lot. Thank you all so much for the time, and we hope to see you again soon.